in our ability to count the cost, it assumes, A, that we know what the cost is going to be, but it also assumes that we understand what we're capable of. And we don't. Because it's in those moments when the universe does punch us in the face, we didn't see it coming. It was way more than we thought, and we get that clarity of, oh, I want this more than I even knew, or I'm capable of more than I even knew.
Welcome back to the Hard But Worth It podcast. My name is Mitch, here with my friends Kirk and Hope. And today we're going to talk about picking your hard. So picking your hard.
Yeah.
Kirk, give us a little context.
So we've often said, and you'll hear us say over and over and over, that we think there's a hard but worth it and a hard but not worth it, but there is no easy button. And what that sort of plays out is that there's these two versions of hard, but it's the same word. And Hope uses this metaphor of hard being like a suitcase. And there it is. We got this word hard, but when you open it up, there's all kinds of different things inside of it. The word hard can be a really negative word. Like there's some hard things that you should avoid, but there's some hard things you can't avoid. And then there's some hard things you should pick. And how do you know the difference? And how do we play with this word hard? So I think on this episode, we're playing with this idea of unpacking the word hard, because there's a way in which I think you have to pick the hard that you're going to go after in life. There's a lot of people that we work with are setting goals. They're building these visions of the future that they want to go after. And there's a real value in that. But when they get involved in it, if they haven't picked the hard that goes with the goal, they get into it and they find out it's there, and it can be a little disheartening or maybe crush their spirits, or it's hard to get over and be resilient to that. But if the degree to which you can look at this thing you want to go after and then recognize the hard bits along the way, well, you can pick it or not. And that's important. And another way I think about this is if you're going after some goal, there might be multiple routes to get there, and they're all valid. So maybe you should look at the cost of these different routes. What's involved? So if you think about scaling a business, if you want to grow, there's a lot about that that's really hard. There's a lot about it that's really worth it too. But you can grow with bringing on equity investment, bring on partners. You can grow by going out and getting loans. You can put your house up as collateral, things like that. Or you can bootstrap it, make money along the way. But there's give and take in all those choices. If you're going to bootstrap, you're probably going to grow slower. If you're going to bring on equity partners, you're going to get this whole other voice and people that you're responsible to. You have their money. There's pressure involved in that. And so there's a way in which you can lay out your options in front of you, and you want to pick the hard that gets you to the worth it in the best way.
Yeah, I think you're right in that. I mean, just thinking about it from my perspective, it's so easy thinking of the futurist in me. And I think we all approach probably vision and ideas from our strengths, our different vantage point that we might. So for me, it tends to be really easy to start in with the futuristic. I can see the result, the big shiny thing. I can see the flag getting planted on top of that mountain and standing up there taking a selfie and having a proud moment. But for me, I don't necessarily, and this is just true about me, I don't necessarily look at hard at a level that probably I should, or at least I've learned over the years, I need to look at that more specifically, because I can sometimes tend to minimize the cost. For me, in my style of leadership, I tend to minimize the pain or the struggle. And as a result, you get to it and it feels a lot bigger, and everyone around you can get a little discouraged because you kind of, you minimize it from the beginning, and others were on your team going, no, actually, it's probably going to cost you 5 times more and take, 2 years longer.
We're exposed to so many options nowadays. And with media and how that was, if you go back, into, 100, 200 years ago, you only saw what was right around you. So you saw the process. You saw that if your family wanted to become entrepreneurs, what the process looks like. Yeah. And nowadays we can look at we have so many options and choices, and we can look at so many people's different lives through social media or through YouTube or all these different options. And we don't see the process. We don't, we just see the outcomes. And we don't think of going, well, what is part of the process to get there? And because we're not familiar with it, we just focus on the outcome.
Right.
So my son, he was looking, you know, when I remember when he was like 15, 16, we started going, well, son, what do you like to do? What are you thinking about doing after high school? And he was like, oh, I want to go into the military. I'm like, okay, why don't we go talk to 3 or 4 people who've been in different aspects of the military so that you can hear and really do that. But there's no difference between I have this business idea, I want to be an entrepreneur, I want to go after this thing, I want to be a parent, I want to have kids. Right? Yeah. Maybe don't go talk to other people. Actually, there are times where it's demotivating, right? but it's helpful to go talk and find out what's the journey look like? And maybe what's a little hard for someone won't be quite as hard for you, but at least you're seeing the process.
Right.
And it's oftentimes when we don't know what we don't know, we just hit blindsided. Like, I wasn't expecting it. I didn't know that they had this sleeping model of a child that doesn't, or this model of a child that doesn't sleep.
Right.
I didn't know that.
Right.
I thought all models of babies slept. And so because I wasn't expecting it, it actually was harder than what it probably had to be.
Well, I like what you said there too, and in considering the team or whoever it is that are your key people that you might be running with in that stage, because what's hard for you may not be hard for them. And I think sometimes it's like a hard language, right? We all experience that in different ways. And sometimes we can assume that everyone is thinking or feeling the same way we are. And by having that conversation, you actually open it up to consider other people. For example, I was just in a conversation this week, and 3 of some of my key executive leaders in my company, you know, they're like J's, you know, on the Myers-Briggs. And so the minute you make a decision, they're ready to start and get it done the next day. I'm more like, we've got plenty of time, you know, if I've got 10 weeks and I'll wait till like 9.5 to even start thinking about it, you know. And it came up to where we're planning this event, and one of my team said, well, you know, how long do we have? And they looked at the calendar and they said, we have about 10 weeks. And me realizing over time that she thinks hard differently than I do, I asked a follow-up question, which was actually a good leadership moment for me, because sometimes I don't. I was like, so are you saying that's plenty of time, 10 weeks? To getting to this event, or are you saying that's not enough time? She goes, oh no, that's not enough time. And I was thinking, we have plenty of time, right?
Right.
And so here it is, what you're talking about is we have people that are carrying this vision with us. And so getting into the conversation, what does hard look like, helps us, I think, really understand each other and what we're willing to do together, right, to get there.
There's a methodology of thinking through processes called the 6-hat thinking method that many people probably heard of. And without going into the whole thing, it's a way of thinking together. And one of the ways that we love to think together is really positive, like really like, what are all the opportunities, and like, how could this go amazing? And then there's that one person who wants to be we call them the Debbie Downer, right? And we're like, you're just being you're throwing rain on our parade, and we do all that, right? But in this thinking method, what we all want to do is actually join that person for a moment and actually think through all the ways this could go wrong.
Right.
And really outline it, like write them all down. Or another way I think about this is I listen to people that are building contracts. And we got an idea, and we get an MOU put together, and it's like, okay, we got to build a contract. And they write it, and then they come in and they're reading a contract, and they read it through the lens of, what if everything goes great? And they read the opportunity, they read the money they're going to make, and their lens is everything's going to go great. And I'm like, okay, now, great. Now I want you to walk into a dark room in your mind and get really cynical. Like, what if everything goes wrong? And then reread the contract. And it's like, it just completely pivots how the language works.
Sure.
Learning how to do that is a skill that mitigates all kinds of risks, because you don't want to live in that dark place. But we all know stories where people just needed to understand that the contract was not written well, and the thing that they were afraid of actually happened.
Yeah.
And then what?
What are the reasons we found now at this stage of life that people don't do hard, or they don't pick their hard well?
Yeah.
You know, what would be some reasons for that?
So the two that I think come to mind first or drive this in my mind is we've lived life in a way. Most of us have enough experiences where that was the hard but not worth it. And we're trying to avoid that. And that's a good thing to avoid. But what we've got is connected is the hard is what made it not worth it. And we haven't yet had the experience that there's a hard but worth it. Mm-hmm. So we're trying to go from hard but not worth it. Like those experiences, I want to avoid that at all cost. And then we flip to there must be an easy. There must be an easier way. And so we've got hard framed wrong. We don't have all the options in front of us. So they're just avoiding the hard because they're looking for the easy. But there's not an easy. There is a worth it, that idea. And then I also think that there's a notion that people they're pursuing, we'll call it wholeness or health or being fixed or settled or content, or there's all these words we use, this experience and then everything works.
Right.
But I don't think we actually get there.
Yeah.
But we want that. We want it really bad.
Yeah.
And there's a way in which you can get to a spot where the thing that you've worked hard on might work now.
Yeah.
But everything never just works.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, it kind of puts a new spin on this saying that we have in our culture, which is work smarter, not harder.
Yeah.
But in a sense, we need to work smarter about the harder, mm-hmm. right? And really look at, because you're using the suitcase analogy, which I think is a really good picture, because we know hard is something, but many of us, we don't want to open it to see what's actually in there. Mm-hmm. You know, so there's this thing you're talking about, which is opening the suitcase and beginning to really process what is involved with your hard, mm-hmm. counting the cost.
Right. So for me, one of the things, one type of hard that I encounter are things that would require sustained energy over a long period of time, AKA maybe a marathon. Mm-hmm. And those are things for me that are harder, if I keep in kind of hard, is where there has to be kind of a sustained energy. And so we all know that if you are hungry or you're tired or you've gone through a lot of stress, how you respond to hard things is affected by that, sure. right? And so understanding for, I think, each person, you know, maybe it's resistance, maybe it's a weak area, you know, it's just an area that's not your preference. You just don't like it, right? You know, I think understanding that that's where we will probably feel or experience those hard things, then we can make a plan for it. Mm-hmm. Because making a plan right. for the hard times is much better than not thinking there will be a hard time.
Right.
Well, and there's a too hard moment.
Yeah.
Right. And that's the point we bail or we exit. But we can exit with dignity, I think, when we've actually looked into the suitcase and we've defined what our hard is going to be worth.
Right.
So we do the work to say, hey, like I remember when we started our business, you know, many years ago, there was this sense of we have about $30,000 on 4 or 5 credit cards. That's what I had available. And so there was this point where we said we can go as hard as 30,000. And if for some reason this doesn't get off the ground and start to take flight, well, we know there's an exit. We can kind of lick our wounds and maybe pay 15,000 each and get out of this. But we kind of looked at it and said, here's how hard we're willing to go. And then beyond that, probably not going to be worth it. And I think that's kind of the dynamic that we face when we're dealing with our hard, because we're all so unique. But taking the time to sit and stare, you use an illustration of like, we have to look at these monsters or these things, you know, these mysterious figures that we call hard, mm-hmm. and we have to actually look at them in the eye and have a bit of a conversation with them.
Mm-hmm. They're trying to, I like to think of those things as teachers. They are trying to teach you something. And if you keep moving in life, they are going to teach you something, right? You're going to get punched in the face by the universe, right? You don't have to lean into it, right? You don't have to be surprised by it. That's a better way to say it.
I found it just better not to know it's coming.
Being able to stare at that part of the equation, I think some people are afraid of what they'll see. They're afraid that it might make them not do it, right? It might make it not worth doing. Something like that. What I think is happening though in the framework of the not worth it and the worth it is that often the hard is what makes it worth it. It's not just that it's the part you don't like. It's that it's the part that brings the meaning. And without it, the outcome wouldn't have the same impact on you. It's the climb where you spend all day trying to get to the vista, and it's exhausting and it's hard, and you're going up this trail and your muscles hurt, and you're not sure you're going to make it, and then you do. Without the climb, the vista's not as interesting. It's not as beautiful. It's not as, if you could have taken a scooter to the top or a gondola, for instance, right? It's still good. It's not like it's bad, but there's something about the struggle that sweetens the outcome. So it's not, that's another part of the hard. There's some hard, it's like, if I could avoid this, I would, but I can't. So here we go.
Yeah.
But in so many things that I'm pursuing, it's that struggle it's where the meaning comes from.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think for me, it's easy to avoid certain types of fears as if they don't belong there, or almost as if they need to stay out. And, I don't know how you guys deal with it, but there are these fears that can show up, and it's like, how did you get here? Like, I didn't invite you. Like, you weren't invited to this thing, but here you are. And you can pretend by not looking at it, keeping it vague. There's almost this denial that can occur where you almost say, "Fear, I don't have any fear. Fear's out there." So we try to lock the doors, close the windows, shut the blinds. But I've learned through the process of denying too many times and the pain that brings into my life, that actually no, fear was actually there the whole time. And it wasn't outside, it was actually in. And most likely, I let fear in. Someone else didn't leave the door open. So then it's turning to fear and beginning to sit with it, knee to knee, eye to eye, and actually begin to go, okay, what is it? Why are you here? What is the fear really getting at? Is it tied to some lie I'm believing, some ego extrinsic type of thing that really isn't going to satisfy me anyway? Then all of a sudden you do that work, and what appeared to be hard isn't as hard as you thought, because you actually sized it up, you named it, you got specific, and you defined it.
Yeah. The idea that it's not as hard as you thought, I think, is actually a big part of this. When you stare at the hard, when you stare at when you count the cost, it now becomes a number, we'll say, and that's how much it costs. It's like, or defining the gap. I think a lot of people are looking out at their goals and they feel the gap, but what they're actually feeling is all the gaps. And because the gap doesn't get defined, it gets overwhelming. But when you actually can define it and bring it into like, it's that, that's what I'm going to have to do. Well, now it's contained. Now you can choose it. You can actually figure out how to overcome it. You can take it apart. It's not as hard as we often think, but when it's this vague, mysterious,
right?
You got to sit with it, stare at it, count it.
What are some practical ways that we can pick our heart and really go through the process? Are there some practical steps? Like, I think of the person who's starting up, it's a little more abstract, I think, because you don't know what you don't know. You're kind of new. You're just getting your legs, learning to walk. So we give space for that. But there still are some things that we can do, training wheels, some guardrails, some things that we can do to help that person in that stage. But then there's people who are maybe in, phase 2 or phase 3 of scaling their business. They've got through early struggle. They're now moving on into growing and scaling. But sometimes the same picking your hard, it's a different hard, but it's a similar process. What are some of the steps or practical things that we found that maybe we've learned along the way?
Well, one of the things Hope always says is just do the next thing. And if you're only doing the next thing, you might know more about what that hard is than all the hards. And you can actually, if you get appropriate steps, you can actually see more about what the hard is, and then you can pick it.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're taking too big of a step, that's where I think you get in trouble with,
Yeah.
I don't know what I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think scaling or scoping your steps to just one at a time and the next one.
Yeah.
is
I
one way to do it.
like something that we say here at Ikon Coaching too, which is this idea of strategic planning versus forecasting and guessing. But I think it's too getting clear that we may have to get real narrow on our horizon line, in the next 6 months to year to be specific, rather than trying to be specific about 5 years out, because the arc of the horizon line, we can't really see as far as we used to. You're talking about the farmer, in the 1500s. Today, I mean, that's changing so fast. But maybe a practical thing is to shorten up your vision, your strategic plan into 6 months to a year, and get really clear about those next things.
Yeah, there are actually studies done around runners. Funny, we should mention running again and marathons, but that they focus. How do they actually create that endurance and push through those moments where they actually want to quit or their body has depleted itself? And they say that they set focal targets closer and they focus on a target because if they keep their vision scanning, it actually doesn't allow them to focus their energy. So by having that focus, moving the goal, okay, if I can get to here, okay, if I can get to here. So that's one way we navigate the hard, right? If we're in the middle of hard, how do we endure and keep moving? We set that target relatively close.
Yeah.
We get to it. We set it a little further and we go
Yeah,
like
that's
that.
really good.
Another way that I think that you can practically figure out how to pick your hard is by talking to people who have done it before. And I think a lot of times when we're doing that, we're seeking inspiration. We're seeking what we think of as motivation around the goal, around the prize and the result. We look to people who have done it before. We see their outcomes. We're like, I want that, right?
Yeah.
And it's harder to listen to them, or sometimes it's hard to even extract. Tell me about the hard parts. Sometimes we don't want to talk about that part of the equation. But if you can really sit with somebody and say, great, I like the outcome. Tell me what made it hard. Break that down for me. Be specific. There are some dark nights on those journeys.
Yeah.
And if you can look at that and go, okay, that's the level of pressure that I was under. That's how it frayed my relationships. This was the risk and all those sort of things. If you talk to 3, 4, 5 of people and you can get that kind of information, you can build a picture. And then you can say, am I ready to tackle that? And if not, how do I get ready to tackle that?
Yeah, it's really good. I like to use a process that is really thinking through at some point the worst case scenario.
Yeah.
And I do that with people on my team because I don't naturally, again, I tend to minimize the worst case scenario, and I need people in my life who give me the real perspective. But we talk about what we want to do, and then if it feels significant, then we give equal time to that, to the level of significance it might be. So if it's a big budget item or feels like a big change in the company, we're going to give more time to mapping out the worst case scenario. But we just try to list all the things. What's the worst that can happen? It's kind of like you talk about reading the contract through a lens of all the things that can go wrong. Because what I found is if you do that really well, chances are, not all the time, but chances are even the worst case scenario still makes it worth it. It's still worth making a step forward because it's not as bad as you might have thought. And some of my people on my team need to not be so negative and make everything so hard. I may minimize, they tend to maximize. So somewhere we meet in the middle and then we move forward with a more realistic plan and hit our goals more realistic. Yeah.
I think sometimes there's this notion that if it's hard, there's something wrong or broken or
that's good.
There's something inherently not right about what's happening. And that perspective. Sometimes, you know, it's kind of, I heard recently this thing about there's a difference between being hurt and being harmed.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like if we went out into the gym and you asked me to lift 100 pounds more than what I normally can do, I'm probably going to hurt, but I could be harmed if it was too much, right? But there's something in the hurting, which actually means something's happening. So friction, something's moving, something's happening. And I think hard sometimes just means something's happening, something's stretching, it's growing.
Yeah.
It's not inherently broke or something's wrong or it may not ever work, you know, and coming to some of those conclusions we make about the feelings of things being hard.
Yeah, which is why having community in your life too is so important. You know, having some of the mentors, people who might be a little further ahead of you, who've walked through some of those struggles. You know, they've paid some of that price because they can help you recognize that the hurting you're feeling is not harmful. It's actually for your own good.
Right.
It's called growing. You know, and we need fathers and mothers and mentors in our life to remind us that doing things that cause pain doesn't mean it's harming us. It actually could be for our own good. And when you're out on your own, running like a maverick, detached from people, then the pain can start to feel like you're doing something wrong or you're hurting to a point where this isn't good. And then you actually make a poor decision.
We another tool that we can use is, and we often do this to help people get inspired in the positive sense, is we have them do vision boards. And they put all the things that are going to, all the worth it stuff, everything is, all the outcomes. And we make these beautiful pictures and we look at them and we want to, you know, use that to inspire ourselves to move forward. And that's a helpful thing. But if you make instead of vision, a nightmare board, right? Or the dark version of this, what are all the things that could go wrong? It's that same idea. If you build that, you're either going to, you have two things that can emerge. Some people build vision boards that are just escape fantasies. They're just, it's never going to happen, right? And then you can look at your nightmare board and you can go, well, that's also never going to happen. You know, it's like the worst case scenario is not that I end up homeless, divorced, bankrupt, living under a bridge.
Yeah.
It's possible. It's so improbable that really isn't what this nightmare board should look like. And our vision boards need to come into some perspective as well. Because when you actually build these negative sides, the hard stuff, you can start to go, okay, I'm afraid this could happen. And I'm afraid this could happen. And it could. Like, that could happen. Then you can look at it and go, well, what would I do to mitigate that? What are 3 things I could do to make that less likely? And if you do good work around that, you can actually pull those things away from the edge. You can do something, and you can have an impact on the hard bits.
Yeah.
And so sitting down and actually, you can do that in writing. You can do that any way that it's the opposite of goal setting. Anything we do in goal setting, you can do in this side of in the hard setting as well. And just like in goal setting, you can then break it down and you can work it through and have an impact on whether these bad things happen or not. There's so many things that people experience in their pursuit of what they want that are the hard bits, and they're surprised. They're just shocked that this happened. But if you've been through the pattern before, it's like, no, that's totally expected. I had a client walk in one day, a long time ago, and she was so inspired and excited to start this business. And she had. And she'd been at it a year and a half or so, and she was out of money. She was exhausted. It was way harder than she thought. And she somehow thought it was all just going to come together and be great, right? Early stage entrepreneur. And she sits down on my couch and we're sitting there talking and she's describing what's going on and it's just overwhelmed her. And every single thing she's describing is totally normal. She picked entrepreneurship.
That's right.
And so I said that to her. I said, yeah, you picked entrepreneurship and this is what it looks like.
Yeah.
Do you want to keep going? And she was like, oh, there's nothing broken? There's nothing wrong? No.
Yeah.
This is exactly what it looks like. And then we went to work and we built the company.
Yeah. I think it's so easy to get caught up in the swirl of like a dream culture.
Yeah.
You know, you're in this place of wouldn't it be great? And I can certainly get lost in that. But what we're saying is there's another side that we have to tether that to, which is the cost. I think we know that any person that's looking to build something, if they're wise, is going to count the cost. You know, you think of some of our friends who are developing property. You know, I think of Josh Johnson or Mike Davis and these guys. They don't just fall into a dream of buying 100 acres and thinking it's all going to come together. I mean, they get the dream, but then they pull back and they pull the people around them to begin to assess, you know, are the permits possible? What's the cost of all the underground stuff that no one ever sees before the buildings are even built? And all of a sudden, they're like, yep, not worth it. And they move on, or yep, it's worth it. And then the tractors are out there and they start moving dirt and getting it done. I think that's what we're saying is, you know, we want a dream, but we also want to tie it to the counting the cost, picking the hard.
I think I've experienced that side of it, but there's also that side of it where I think if I look back over things in my life, if I knew how hard it would have been, that it was going to be, I wouldn't have chosen it. And so there is a little bit of to be blind to the hard.
Sure.
You know, isn't a bad thing either. I think there's, you know, we'll never make a decision, or we'll never go into there because we can only imagine how hard it's going to be. There's that fine balance between being realistic about, these are going to be, you know, I probably should consider these things, versus most of the things that's been the most transformative of my life, that have been the hardest things in my life, I probably would not choose if I was to go back to my 30-year-old self right now. So in some ways, I'm glad. I think it's also, like I said, what do we do who are we surrounding ourselves? What's our plan for when it gets hard? And I think that's the difference in my 40s and my 30s, is now I actually expect hard, and I have a little bit more of a plan for when it gets hard.
Yeah. But I think what I would say to that too is maybe going on is when we fall into something that's hard that we didn't see coming, which is why I'd rather have the universe punch me in the face and not know it's coming. I think in those moments, our willingness to endure and pay the price is really at that point tied to the vision and the conviction that we have, because it's not just this could be, but those things that we fumble into, or we find ourselves in that we didn't see coming, that just become really difficult. We endure them because there's a level of conviction of this should be, this has to happen. I'm willing to die for it. I didn't count the cost. I didn't even know it, but I'm so committed intrinsically that I'm willing to pay the price. But when those things come at us unexpectedly, I think we also have found moments where we bailed, right? And I certainly have. I have these things where I thought I wanted some things, and then all of a sudden it got hard because I didn't count the cost, and I'm the first one out going, that was a bad idea. So through the process, we can't necessarily analyze every hard.
Not at all.
And I think you're right. We don't want to overanalyze it because some of us would never get started. But at the same time, if we would at least look at it, it helps us appreciate the fact sooner that maybe this isn't worth it. And the sooner I can abandon a bad idea or a great idea that I'm not willing to pay for, the sooner I can get on with the things that actually matter most to me.
Yeah. I love that you're bringing this up, because in our ability to count the cost, it assumes, that we know what the cost is going to be, but it also assumes that we understand what we're capable of. And we don't, because it's in those moments when the universe does punch us in the face. We didn't see it coming. It was way more than we thought, and we get that clarity of, oh, I want this more than I even knew, or I'm capable of more than I even knew. And I've had a few experiences in my life where that's happened. People talk about this in all kinds of ways. We say we dig deep, or we go to a place we never knew existed, or we come to the end of ourselves, but there was something else. And when you start to rely on strength from a community, from a faith tradition, from something that you didn't even know was there, but once you find it, you don't have to give it back. It sets a new standard for what you're able to do. And I think that's a lot of where the meaningful growth comes from. Very specifically, when our first son was born, he had open heart surgery at 3 days old. And so that turned out to, that was not part of the plan. I had no, you don't count that cost. You don't assume that, right? And so this big traumatic event happens. He's flown away to another city. We get down there. We then live in the hospital for a long time, 3 weeks or so. And then the day we leave, they told us this was happening. They said another couple has just arrived with a baby who has the exact same condition and you realize that they're where I was 3 weeks ago. And I knew what I felt like. Like, there's no way I can live with, I can't do this. How do you do this? I don't know what to do. And we walked out and I watched them walk by. We didn't talk, but I watched them walk by and they were just ghostly looking, right? All the life had been sucked out of them. And I didn't feel that way anymore. I did it. There was a lot more to go.
Yeah.
But just in those 3 weeks, I had done something I didn't know I was capable of doing.
Wow.
I would have never picked, I wouldn't wish it on anybody, right? But I had learned something about what I was capable of.
Yeah.
We are far more resilient than we even know, far more capable. I was having this conversation with a coaching client this morning and talking about a future life transition and stage and some things they want. And there's so much, fear about, well, what it's going to require, what's going to be hard. And she's looking around her at all of these other, paths that her friends are taking. And she's just like, I don't know. And to be on the other side of that, to just like you were on the other side and to go, I remember what that felt like.
Yeah.
But I also remember with every transition and every change, I actually grew and expanded with it. And a mentor of mine once said, you can't fly in the airspace above you. Yeah. He was in pilot training. You can't fly in the airspace above you. And sometimes I think we are trying to look and be in a space that we're just not in yet.
Yeah.
And yes, we want to find out, we can discover what's hard and find those things out and prepare. But I think our power lies in not controlling it and controlling the hard, but it lies in our ability to respond, to adapt, to grow through it. And then it allows us to face it with some courage.
Yeah. I like that too, of growing. And I think this just sounds so obvious, but when we don't choose in to the hard, we don't grow.
You don't.
And when you do choose into it, you do grow. So there is this truth that says, what feels hard for me today won't feel hard for me tomorrow.
Right.
And hopefully what feels a little easier today felt hard for me yesterday. And as we move forward, that should be kind of the evolving sign of growth, that we are growing, because we're getting bigger, we're getting stronger. And sometimes we're getting stronger in the same things and we think we're failing because, man, I thought I dealt with this 5 years ago, this fear of man or this ego thing. And it's like, no, you did, but now you're growing it bigger, right? You're just getting stronger in the same area.
Yeah. Yeah, you're not fixed. Well, you kind of are. There's a way in which you are, like in that situation, in that subject, at that level, that's now easy for you. But there's more levels.
Yeah.
We don't finish this process. There's if you sit down with people who've lived long enough and you start to ask the question about what has shaped you, what are the things that have made you who you are today? And we call those transformational events, where your paradigm or your worldview or something about the way you're approaching the world changed because of this event, right? Those transformational events, and most people don't have a lot of them. We have a handful of those things. And more often than not, the majority of those will be things that were very, very hard, maybe even bad, maybe even traumatic. Sometimes there are things that were extraordinarily good in that sense, that can actually do the same work. But more often than not, they're in this category that we would call hard. And it's the kind of thing you wouldn't wish on your enemy, but you also wouldn't be who you are today without it. And so there's a way in which you wouldn't give it back. Those are those moments that you can't prepare for. You can't plan for them. You can know they're coming. You can't get the timing of that right.
Right.
And so I think all these little hard things that we do along the way prep us for that in a way. There's a picking your hard that goes, I'm willing to lean into that. That's a hard I'll do. I'm not looking for the easy button anymore. I'm going after life. And we build our capacity to do hard things so that when those big ones happen, and I think they happen to everybody, you have the resiliency for it. Otherwise, those things do break people too. They don't recover sometimes.
Right.
Or it might take them a long time to recover. So I think something about picking your hard is a frame of mind that allows us to recognize that hard's part of the deal. You're not getting away from it.
Yeah, it is.
And gosh dang it, when I was young, I wish I could have gotten away from it. I was trying all the time. It's just part of the deal. So that when the universe comes along and actually lands a solid blow right on your chin and rings your bell and you go down and you're sitting on your knees wondering if you'll ever get up again, it's like, oh, that's right.
Yeah.
I can do this. It's hard.
For the benefit of others.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, that actually is part of what can make it worth it too, right? Is when there's on the other side of hard. You know, there's things that I think that's been hard for me that will not be as hard for my kids because I walked through that and now I'm able to pass on to them the learning.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes there's things with other business people, like they went through, you know, they're farther along in the journey and they went through hard things and they went through that lawsuit and they went through those things and now they're able to pass along some wisdom.
Yeah.
And I think that's what wisdom, right? Wisdom actually can help us avoid the hard.
Yeah.
And so there's a good kind of wisdom that is beneficial that way.
We've all made that mistake. You don't have to.
Yeah, there is stupid hard.
There is.
I have a few stars for that one. I think I love that because I think one of the things we teach our children when we do hard things, I mean, that's one of the things, you know, Lanice and I tried to forge in our family, which is we will do hard things. We will pick our hard. We are not going to raise our kids thinking life comes to them on a silver spoon, even though we may be able to afford certain luxuries and things. We're gonna do the work. And I think by embracing that early on, you teach your kids also a value, because there's a counterintuitive thing as a parent where you kind of want to insulate your kids and protect from the bad world that's out there. But to do that to a fault is to deprive your children, I think, of a attribute that they need to actually survive and actually thrive in the world, which is I know hard's coming and I can go through hard because I saw my parents model that. I saw them grow through. I think we do that also with those in our businesses, in our organizations as well. When we face the hard, we pick the hard, we don't avoid it. We build people who follow right in our footsteps. Well, I think we gave quite a bit to think about on picking your hard in this episode of Hard But Worth It. If you're listening in, we want to thank you for listening to the Hard But Worth It podcast. If you liked it, we ask you to go ahead and click that subscribe button, follow us, maybe give us a comment, let us know you're out there, and we look forward to seeing you again on our next episode.